So there has been a great drop. Back in the 1970s, 90% of Americans identified as Christian. Now, that percentage is much lower and continues to snowball downwards. A huge shift has occurred. What happened? They're all massively converting to Islam? No, that's not what happened. They are converting to no religion. They are becoming atheists and agnostics. And surveys that were done to understand the reasons for this trend, which gained momentum in the late 1990s and the beginning of the millennium, revealed the following common reasons. Learning about evolution in college. Rational thinking makes religion go out the window. Religion is the opiate of the people. Too many Christians do unchristian things. Organized religious groups are more divisive than uniting. Until, like I said, the mid-1990s, believing God was still the norm in this country. To understand how we got where we are now, let us first take a look at history. I discussed in a previous khutbah how Isaac Newton, arguably one of the best and greatest scientists ever, viewed science as an act of piety to understand the laws of nature established by the divine creator. Even his contemporaries had similar views and were believers in God. Now, Newton died in 1727. After that, the Enlightenment era started. And this was accompanied and was the product of the scientific revolution in Europe at that time in the 18th century. And the ideas emerged during the Enlightenment era, such as scientific evidence, individual liberties, separation of church and state. And philosophers of that time, notably David Hume and Immanuel Kant, had influence in arguments that denied the existence of God. So one very prevalent and strong argument for the existence of God was what's called the design argument. Now this has been considered a strong argument for centuries. And the argument basically likened or used the analogy of complex nature of living organisms to that of a complex clock or a watch, which required the action of an intelligent designer, a watchmaker. So a watch cannot just come out of nothing. It needs somebody to make it, and that was a good argument. Now, Hume argued that this is flawed logic. He said biologic organisms reproduce themselves, and therefore, unlike a clock, they can originate from a primeval organism. His argument, however, did not gain much support, even from the secular philosophers of his time. The other philosopher I mentioned, Kant, he took aim at the cosmological argument. The most famous cosmological argument was advanced by Al-Ghazali, and it goes like this. Whatever begins to exist must have a cause, something that made it exist. The universe began to exist, therefore, the universe has a cause for its existence. And again, this argument held on for centuries. Now, Kant cast doubt on the validity of the second part of the argument, which says that the universe began to exist. He said, who says the universe began to exist? The universe may be eternal. It's been there forever. An argument which is now rejected by the Big Bang theory. Move on another half a century forward, and we arrive at Charles Darwin. He had a much more impact against the design argument. He published his book, his famous book, The Origin of Species, in 1859. He introduced the concept of natural selection as the mechanism of evolution of species. He rejected any explanation based on creation. Interestingly, however, and this is an important point, Darwin never even attempted to explain the origin of the first organism from which everything else evolves, because natural selection presupposes that there is something that you are selecting from. Now, there were two other figures important to mention at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 1900s that also had significant influence in this view of scientific materialism. Those are, the first one is Karl Marx, and he is the one who famously regarded or infamously regarded religion as the opiate propagated by the bourgeois elite to anesthetize and exploit the working classes. And the other one is Sigmund Freud, who thought that humans invented God as a comforting father figure or a psychological crutch, as he called it. If we go back to Darwin, his original theories were actually originally rejected by the scientific critics at his time. In fact, the French Academy of Sciences declined to even elect Darwin to its zoological section on the basis that both of his books, The Origin of Species and his subsequent book, The Descent of Man, were not science, but, I'm quoting, a mass of unjustified assertions, often evidently deceptive. And by the end of the 1800s, there was like a Darwin fatigue factor, and not many people were talking about his theories anymore. And this went on until the 1940s, when his ideas were revived by the discovery of genetics and Mendel genetics, and neo-Darwinism arose, which is a combination of natural selection with new genetic discoveries. Now, despite the effect of all of the above that I mentioned, religion, and specifically Christianity, was still the dominant religion until the mid-1900s. The rise of this new atheist movement in the US was the product of many factors that preceded that time. After World War II, social and cultural conflicts arose, including issues of gender equality, civil rights movement, and the American society was being reshaped in that time. To put it a bit in context, in 1968, the US Supreme Court overturned previous laws that had banned the teaching of evolution. Move another 18 years, in 1986, the US Supreme Court ruled against teaching creation science. At that time, scientists testified that the case was crucial to the future of basic science education. And in that environment, many non-religious groups were active, but they initially did not have the resources and the reach to become prevalent. But the new millennium brought us the internet, and simultaneously, multiple celebrity atheist scientists were emerging and spreading their ideas on social media. One of the most influential atheist scientists is called Richard Dawkins. He's a British evolutionary biologist. Fun fact, he is the originator of the term meme, which he used in his 1976 book. It's called The Selfish Gene. He introduced the term meme as a concept to describe how cultural ideas and behaviors and styles spread through imitation similar to how genes propagate biological traits. In 1986, he published his book, The Blind Watchmaker. Remember, watchmaker is a specific term. That's the term that's used in the design argument. So he's calling the watchmaker blind. And he argues that evolution can explain the apparent design. The key word here being apparent. The apparent design in nature. And then in 2006, he published a book, The God Delusion, in which he argued that God does not exist and that such belief is a delusion in the face of contradictory evidence. He's saying that there is evidence against that. And his book was a bestseller at that time. Now, that does not mean that his views were universally accepted by scientists. There was a Swedish biologist at that time who did some calculations, and he computed that it would take 500,000 years for natural selection model to produce a properly functioning eye in a fish. Now, Dawkins did not dispute the calculation, and he said that this time frame, 500,000 years, is almost instantaneous by the standards of geological time. I mean, we're talking about a world, that's billions of years old. What's 500,000? So there was a known novelist who responded to him and said that if a fish could speak, the fish would want to tell Professor Dawkins that 500,000 years might seem instantaneous in Oxford, where he was, but down here on the ocean bed, when we needed an eye to protect us from sharks, it seemed rather a long time. Another prominent atheist scientist at that time is another Brit, Stephen Hawking. He was a physicist and a cosmologist and was very well known. He's the one with the disability, the paralyzed scientist. He died in 2018. He said, his famous quote, "I think the universe was spontaneously created out of nothing according to the laws of science." Unquote. قولوا قولي هذا واستغفر الله العظيم فاستغفروه. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده وأشهد أن سيدنا محمدا عبده ورسوله. Our young generation may get the impression from school or from college or from social media that science is in direct conflict with God and that scientific evidence has a strong case against the existence of God. But this, however, is far from being true. I highly recommend a book. The author is called Stephen Meyer. The title of the book is Return of the God Hypothesis. The latest edition was published in 2021. Return of the God Hypothesis. A very good read. And a lot of the material for this khutbah was taken from that. The author, who's a Christian, argues very strongly in 3 scientific domains, demonstrating how new scientific discoveries support the existence of God. And I'll briefly go through them. His first argument is in the field of cosmology. So the prevalent atheist view in the early 20th century, we spoke about that last khutbah, was that the universe is eternal. It does not have a beginning. And this was essential to negate Ghazali's cosmological argument. But the eventual acceptance of the Big Bang theory restored the validity of Ghazali's argument. And then being forced to accept that the universe had a beginning, which is currently accepted as 13.8 billion years, they changed the argument. And now they say the universe has a beginning, but it was created from nothing. That's the quote I ended with from Stephen Hawking. Hawking and others they built on Einstein's relativity theory, and they published models, mostly around 1970, describing how the beginning of the universe as, now some of these are going to be technical terms, I'll try to explain that. It started as a space-time singularity. Now, that term, space-time, originates from Einstein's relativity theory, because in his theory, time is the fourth dimension with space. So he talks about space-time together. The theory had obvious problems in describing where does the energy mass, now again, this term energy mass is also coming from the relativity theory, because energy and mass are convertible, the famous E = mc squared. So where did the energy mass come from before space-time? If the universe started as a space-time singularity, and it started with an energy mass that then exploded and produced the universe, where did it come from? Because there was no space and time before that. And then subsequently, other models emerged, inflationary cosmology, and delving into all of that is well beyond the scope of this khutbah, but you can look at that book and read more about it. It's fascinating. Suffice to say that all these models have very critical flaws. The second argument in the book is from the field of physics. He demonstrates the incredible level of fine-tuning, this is a very important term, fine-tuning, that has been present from the beginning of the universe to allow life to exist on Earth. Now, since the 1950s, the physicists have discovered that life in the universe depends on very highly improbable set of factors that have to be maintained. The precise strength, I'm going to read slow here and explain, of the four fundamental forces of physics are essential for the stability of the universe. Now, when we say the four fundamental forces of physics, those are gravity, electromagnetism, and then the two other forces are within the atom, which are the weak and the strong nuclear forces. Those are the major forces of physics. Those forces have to be precise. For example, if the ratio of the weak nuclear force constant to the strong nuclear force constant, these are forces inside the atom. There is something called the strong force and the weak force inside an atom. The ratio of those forces has to be set to a precision of 1 in 10,000. If you disturb that ratio, you will cause the stars that are powered by hydrogen fusion to not exist. Similarly, if the electromagnetic force ratio to gravity changes, got problems. If you to get beyond helium, that step from helium to carbon, it requires going through an intermediate unstable state. That unstable state is so unstable that its half-life is, think of that number, is 1/millionth of a trillionth of a second. It's 1 in 10 to the power 24 of a second. That's how long it exists, and then it's gone. Lab models have been done, using high-speed reactors to try and recreate a situation to produce carbon. And all of them proved extremely unrealistic. More numbers for you. The strongest of those four forces of physics that I mentioned is the strong nuclear force, the SF. It is 10 to the 40th power stronger than gravity. We're going to call gravity G, and we're going to call that the SNF. So in theory, gravity, the value of gravity, could be anywhere from 0 to 10 to the power 40. If you modify gravity beyond a factor of 10 to the 5, you will produce 10 to the 35. I'm dividing 10 to the 40 by 10 to the 5. Got to review your calculus. That's how precise it has to be. That is 1 in 100 billion trillion parts. Now imagine if there was a universe-producing machine, like a machine. It spits out universes all the time. And spits out universes with different conditions, different initial conditions. One of these is going to be our universe, with the setup that we have. The probability of splitting a universe with the conditions, our same mass energy condition, I don't know how to say this number. It is a mind-blowing number. Because the possible configurations are this. It is 10 to the power 123. I don't know how to say that number. It is a lot of zeros. If I wanted to just say it by saying trillion, I'll spend the whole khutbah, just keep repeating the word, trillion. That is how improbable it is to generate a universe with our conditions. Who set those parameters? The universe-producing machine? The third argument from Stephen Mayers in his book is in the field of biology. It's a discussion of DNA and genetic information in DNA. And I have made the calculation that if I get into that, we will not finish this khutbah. So inshallah, this will be the topic of a future discussion. In February of 1985, there was a conference in Dallas. It assembled world-class lineup of scientists and philosophers to discuss the issue of science and God. In attendance, there was a scientist by the name of Alan Sandage. Now, this was a lifelong agnostic and scientific materialist in the field of cosmology. The shock was that he sat on the theistic side of the table, on the believers' side of the table in that conference. Because he had reached the conclusion, after a lifelong research, based on scientific evidence, because that's what he did, that the world has a creator. It's just all the models made no sense to him in the end. In that same conference also, there was another leading figure, origin of life researcher by the name of Dean Kenyon. He also renounced his own cutting-edge evolutionary theory on the origin of life, based on origin of life simulation experiments that he was conducting, and which increasingly suggested to him that simple chemicals cannot possibly arrange themselves into complex information-bearing molecules unless a biochemist actively and intelligently guides them in the process. And finally, there is an important concept which is discussed in the book that I will mention briefly, but I cannot get into it with the time we have. If the world is 13.8 billion years old, but the Earth is only 4.5 billion years old, then it is not sufficient to say that God the universe and then just let it run itself without further input. Because how did life and genetic information pop up 9 billion years later? In fact, that's the same, we spoke about that last time, but this topic, but on a different argument basis, on the basis of gravitation, was the exact debate between Newton and Leibniz back in the early 1700s. So in summary, just because the US Supreme Court decided some decades ago that only evolution and not creation will be taught in schools, and just because the majority of celebrity scientists happen to be atheists, That does not mean that scientific evidence is actually on their side. They just have the louder bark. اللهم أحسن عاقبتنا في الأمور كلها وأجرنا من خزي الدنيا وعذاب الآخرة. اللهم اقسم لنا من خشيتك ما تحول به بيننا وبين معصيتك ومن طاعتك ما تبلغنا به جنتك ومن اليقين مصائب الدنيا. اللهم لا تجعل مصيبتنا في ديننا ولا تجعل الدنيا أكبر همنا ولا مبلغ علمنا. اتل ما أوحي إليك من الكتاب وأقم الصلاة إن الصلاة تنهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر ولذكر الله أكبر والله يعلم ما تصنعون.